They say a house remembers the hands that built it. The dust in the corners, the way the floor settles at night, the echoes of those who loved within its walls. So when I stood on the sidewalk that cold October morning, watching my son-in-law lock the door I once called home, I felt something inside me fall painfully, quietly out of place. I didn't know then that losing everything would be the beginning of taking it all back. My name is Evelyn Carter, and I am 62 years old, a widow who spent more than half her life building a modest 2-story home in rural Pennsylvania with my late husband Mark. After my daughter Lily passed away unexpectedly, her husband, Thomas, and his parents slowly slipped into the spaces she left behind, first offering help, then quietly claiming authority. I tried to keep the peace, hoping grief would soften all of us, but pain has a way of sharpening certain people instead. What began as shared mourning turned into quiet eviction, and soon I found myself forced into a life I never chose. But sometimes, injustice is the only thing strong enough to wake the courage we thought age had drained from us. The sound reached me before the sight of it, a dry, metallic clicking like winter teeth chattering against each other. I was still halfway up the driveway, the grocery bags cutting into my fingers, when I realized it was coming from my own front door. Thomas stood there with his back to me, shoulders tight, the October wind lifting the hem of his jacket. And for a moment I thought, no, I hoped he was just fixing something that had come loose. But the way he kept his head down, turning the lock over and over in his hand, told me this wasn't repair. This was replacement. The leaves had started falling early that year. They gathered in corners of the yard, brushing against the steps like they were trying to get inside for warmth. I remember stepping over them, steadying the grocery bags against my hip, and calling out his name. Not loud. I didn't have it in me to raise my voice at anyone back then, just enough to be heard by someone who wanted to hear me. But Thomas didn't turn. He didn't even flinch. His mother stood beside him, her hands tucked deep into the pockets of her quilted coat. She looked like a statue someone had placed there without asking her permission. Her eyes flicked toward me once, a quick, startled glance, then dropped to the welcome mat as if reading instructions carved into it. Thomas! He tried again. The wind answered for him, slipping through the bare branches and carrying the faint smell of cold metal and the faint sweetness of the apples in my bags. I walked closer, the gravel crunching under my shoes. That sound used to mean coming home. Lately, it only meant approaching something I wasn't sure I would recognize anymore. Thomas finally spoke, but he didn't turn around. Just simplifying things, he muttered. His voice was low, almost swallowed by the wind. Simplifying. Funny how a word like that can feel like a hammer. I looked at the door. The same door Mark and I painted sage green the summer Lily turned 7. I could still see where Mark nicked the bottom corner with a brush because he was impatient and wanted to take Lily for ice cream before the paint dried. And now Thomas's hands were on that same door, turning it into something I no longer had access to. "What are you doing?" I asked, though the answer sat heavy between us. Thomas shifted, just enough to show the line of his jaw, but not his eyes. "It's temporary," he said, and the words felt too rehearsed. We need some space. To grieve." I let the sentence settle. Like dust. Like insult. His mother exhaled softly beside him. Not a sigh, more like something she'd been holding finally slipping through. She still wouldn't look at me. The wind tugged at her scarf, but she didn't move to fix it. Her whole body was stillness. Peaceful, practiced stillness. Grief is a strange thing. It leaves you raw, tender, flayed open. And right then I felt as though touching anything, even my own anger, might cause something inside me to rupture. My daughter's face flashed in my mind. The way she smiled with her whole mouth, the way her shoulders shook when she tried not to laugh. Lily had been gone only a handful of weeks. Her voice still lived in rooms that weren't being opened anymore. I looked down at the grocery bags. One was starting to tilt, the carton of eggs pushing against the thin paper. I adjusted my grip, the handles cutting deeper into my fingers. It anchored me somehow, the small pain of holding onto something I wasn't sure belonged to me anymore. The silence stretched between us, thin but sharp, like ice forming over a pond. Finally, Thomas turned to face me. His eyes were red, not from crying but from tiredness, maybe frustration. I couldn't tell. Grief can make strangers out of people you once trusted with your life. We need routine, he said quietly. And with everything so. He gestured vaguely at the house, at the locked door, at the invisible absence of Lily. It's complicated. My breath came out in a small cloud. So you're changing the locks, I said as gently as I could. On my home. He blinked. It's just until we figure things out. His mother shifted, clasping her hands in front of her now, her knuckles whitening. She finally met my eyes for half a second, long enough for me to see something like resolve in hers. Not cruelty, just certainty. We thought it was best, she murmured. The words slid into me with a quiet finality. The house behind them was still, watching us the way empty houses do, windows reflecting the pale sky, siding humming faintly in the wind. I could almost feel Mark standing beside me, the old warmth of his hand pressing into my shoulder the way he used to when he didn't know what to say. I swallowed hard. Arguing felt like stepping into a storm I wasn't strong enough to withstand. Using Lily's death as leverage felt like betrayal of her memory, of my own heart. So instead I nodded once. Small nod. The kind you give when you finally understand something you didn't want to. Without a word, I stepped forward, placed the grocery bags gently on the porch, and backed away. Thomas watched me go. His mother watched the bags. Neither of them watched my face. That night, I parked my car under the old elm by the end of the driveway, the one that split in two during a storm years ago but kept growing anyway. I folded the back seat down, tucked my coat beneath my head, and listened to the creaking branches above me. The house glowed faintly through the fogged windshield, warm light leaking from the living room windows. My light. But the key in my pocket no longer fit the lock. I didn't tell anyone where I slept that night. Some humiliations don't announce themselves. They settle quietly, the way frost settles over grass, thin, cold, and impossible to shake off by morning. And as I closed my eyes in the dark, I realized this was the first time in my life I'd ever slept outside my own home while it still stood. It wouldn't be the last. The second week after the lock changed, the house began sounding different to me. Not through the walls, I wasn't sleeping close enough for that anymore, but in the way the silence hit when I stood on the porch. It used to feel warm, like a held breath waiting for Lily's laughter to fill it. Now it felt tight, pressed flat, as if the house was swallowing its own sounds. One evening, as the porch light flickered above me, I heard voices inside. Low, controlled, practiced. They weren't mine. They weren't Lily's. And for the first time I realized how quickly a home can forget who built it. Most days began the same. I would knock on the door with a careful rhythm, not too soft, not too urgent. Just enough to remind them I still existed. Sometimes Thomas opened it. Sometimes his mother did. Sometimes no one came at all, even though I could hear the creak of the floorboards inside. I only ever asked for small things. A sweater, a photo frame, a book. Pieces of a life removed one by one, like threads pulled from a tapestry until nothing recognizable remained. The dining table was the worst part. Through the open kitchen doorway, I'd see it set with the good plates, the ones Mark and I bought when Lily finished college. They were using them now without hesitation, as if they had always belonged to their hands. As if memory didn't cling to the edges of those plates where Lily once set down warm bowls of stew. I'd hear them talking from the hallway. Easy voices. Comfortable. Filling a space that no longer made room for me. Each word felt like a little push backward, nudging me toward the exit even when they smiled politely and asked if I needed anything else. Then, one afternoon, Thomas's mother said, "You should stay for dinner, Evelyn." With a tone so practiced it sounded like she'd been rehearsing it for days. I knew it wasn't affection. Just obligation. Duty. A courtesy extended because someone somewhere would say it was the right thing to do. Still I agreed. I don't really know why. Maybe I wanted to feel close to Lily one more time, even if her chair remained painfully empty. The dining room looked almost the same, But something was different. A slight rearrangement of chairs, a new tablecloth Thomas's father must have brought from their home. The overhead light buzzed softly, flickering just enough to irritate the corner of my eye. I sat where I always sat. No one corrected me, but I noticed the others sitting closer together than before, clustered on one side as if sharing a silent secret. Dinner was pot roast. The smell should have comforted me, but it didn't. It felt borrowed, someone else's attempt at warmth. They spoke with politeness so thin I could see the discomfort beneath it. "How are you managing at your place?" his mother asked, her fork paused midair. I told her I was fine. She nodded, relieved by my lie. Thomas chewed quietly, eyes fixed on his plate. He didn't look at me, not even once. When I asked if he had found Lily's quilt, something I'd been asking for all week, he glanced at his mother before answering. "We're still looking," he said. "Still looking. In a house that wasn't big enough to lose anything unless someone wanted it lost." The clatter of silverware echoed more sharply than it should have. Every scrape against a plate felt like someone dragging metal across my ribs. The air around my daughter's old chair seemed heavier, as if holding onto her outline. I reached toward my water glass and realized my hand was trembling. I hid it beneath the table. Dinner dragged on, each minute stretching like something unraveling. Their voices filled the room, measured, tidy, wrong. Lily used to hum when she cooked, soft, almost aimless melodies. But now there was no humming, no warmth, just conversation that avoided grief like it was contagious. When the plates were cleared, Thomas excused himself to take a phone call. His steps were quick, almost grateful. His mother and father moved to the kitchen to tidy up, though I could hear every word through the thin wall. "We need to think long-term," his mother whispered. "About living arrangements. About what makes sense." Her voice was steady in a way that told me she'd already made up her mind. Thomas's father murmured something agreeing. Then a phrase came through, carried clear on the cold kitchen air. "She can't stay involved. Not like before. Not like before." It was said casually, almost kindly, but it landed with a finality that settled deep inside my chest. I stood there at the edge of the hallway, my hands resting on the back of Lily's empty chair. The wood felt colder than it should have. They didn't see me. And in that moment, I understood something I had been trying not to face. They already envisioned a future I wasn't in. Thomas returned to the dining room a few minutes later. He smiled at me, a small, strained smile, and thanked me for coming. That was all. No invitation to stay. No suggestion of another dinner. Just dismissal wrapped in civility. I swallowed the ache rising in my throat, nodded, and gathered my coat from the hook by the door. The fabric still held a faint scent of Lily's lavender detergent. I pressed it to my face for a heartbeat, then stepped outside before anyone could see my eyes. The night air was cold enough to cloud my breath. I stood on the driveway a long moment, looking at the house. My house, lit from within by people who didn't know its stories, who didn't hear its memories, who didn't feel the gap where Lily used to be. My shoes crunched softly against the gravel as I walked toward my car parked under the dim street lamp. The windows were fogged from the temperature shift, and when I opened the door, the interior smelled faintly of the coffee I'd spilled that morning. I sat in the driver's seat without turning the engine on, letting the silence settle around me. It was gentler than the silence inside the house. They had already decided my place. And it wasn't at that table. It wasn't in that hallway. It wasn't anywhere near the home I built. By the time I rested my hands on the steering wheel, something new, small but unmistakable, had begun forming in the space where hurt had lived for weeks. A decision. Not loud. Not angry. Just steady. The kind of decision that waits quietly for the right moment to be spoken aloud. The house looked different in the morning light, as if it had learned to breathe without me. The windows were pale with winter frost, and the porch boards groaned when I stepped onto them, not in welcome but in warning. I kept my hands in my coat pockets, fingers curled around the small list I'd written the night before. Just a few things. Lily's quilt, her journals, the letters she used to tuck into her dresser drawer. But the closer I walked toward her room, the more it felt like I was walking into a memory that didn't belong to me anymore. The hallway was colder than I remembered. Maybe because last night after Thomas closed the door on me, I still believed morning would soften something. The air, the mood, even their hearts. But morning light doesn't fix people. It only makes their intentions easier to see. I hadn't set foot inside since the funeral. Back then, her room still smelled faintly of lavender lotion and the old cedar trunk she kept beneath her bed. She used to sit cross-legged on the floor, scribbling in her journals, hair falling into her eyes as though it was trying to protect her thoughts. Now I needed something that held her handprint. Something that proved she existed in ways grief couldn't erase. I walked slowly like each step needed permission. The carpet fibers felt stiff and used, as though the hallway had been frozen in time while everything inside me kept moving, unraveling. At the end of the hall, Lily's door was cracked open. Tiny sliver. Enough to pull breath out of my lungs. I imagined the quilt folded on her bed, the one she stitched with me the summer she turned 12. I imagined her handwriting, how her letters curled like she was always trying to soften the world. I didn't expect to be stopped before I reached it. I should have. Thomas's mother appeared in front of me like a shadow stepping out of the wall. She held a mug between her hands, steam curling up like it was trying to escape her. "Oh," she said, smiling too gently, too sweetly. "It's not a good time." Her voice had that sugar-coated cadence, soft on the outside, sharpened underneath. The kind you hear from someone who has spent years learning how to sound kind without ever meaning it. I swallowed. "I just need a few things from Lily's room." She didn't move. Her body filled the hallway like a closed gate. Behind her shoulder, through that narrow opening in the door, I saw the boxes, stacked neatly, labeled in handwriting that wasn't Lily's. My chest tightened. It looked like they were preparing to send my daughter away for a second time. "I won't be long," I whispered, though my voice barely carried. "Just her quilt, her journals. That's all." She tilted her head, as though considering whether my grief was inconvenient or simply unnecessary. "We're sorting things right now. It's better if you come back later." Sorting things. Things. Not Lily's belongings. Not parts of her life. Just things. I took one step to the side, trying to look past her, but she shifted, blocking the view again. Her mug clinked softly against her ring, the sound small but deliberate, a reminder of her presence, her authority. I didn't realize my hands were trembling until I felt the paper list crinkle inside my pocket. The trembling wasn't fear. It was something older, heavier, the part of me that refused to accept another door closing. "Lily was my daughter before she was your son's wife," I said quietly. My voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Grief had carved it into something steady. Her smile didn't falter, but her eyes cooled. "That may be true," she murmured, "but Thomas is handling things now. He knows what's best." Best for who? Best for them. Best for their comfort, their convenience, their version of the story. I looked again at the stacked boxes. Cardboard taped shut. Lily's handwriting unable to breathe inside them. For a moment my knees felt weak, like the floor had dropped an inch beneath me. That ache, sharp, familiar, rushed up from somewhere deep. The same ache I felt the night we lost her. The ache of a goodbye you never agreed to. I pressed a hand against the wall to steady myself. The wallpaper was cold, textured under my fingertips. It grounded me in the quietest way. When I looked back at her, something inside me finally shifted. Not a break, more like the first crack in an ice sheet. Small but unstoppable. "I understand," I said softly. She seemed satisfied with that, stepping back slightly, already ready to turn away. Already assuming I would shrink again, the way grief had made me shrink for months. But I didn't move toward the door. I moved toward the stairs. Outside, the air felt sharper, cleaner, as if winter itself was drawing a long breath. I walked down the porch steps slowly, each creak echoing behind me like the house was watching to see if I would come back. I didn't take the quilt. I didn't take the journals. I didn't take anything. But as I reached my car, I felt something settle in my chest. Not peace, not yet, but resolve. A small ember of it. Quiet, steady, waiting for me to breathe life into it. I looked back at the house one last time. Its windows stared down like indifferent eyes. "They won't pack her away," I whispered to the cold air. "Not like that." And for the first time since Lily died, I felt myself standing tall. The night I finally gave up trying to sleep in my car, the frost on the windshield looked like tiny spiderwebs catching the streetlight. I wiped a circle clear with my sleeve, but the cold kept claiming it back, like it didn't want me to see the road ahead. Somewhere nearby, a porch light flicked on. I heard the soft crunch of slippers on gravel. Then a voice, steady, familiar. "I figured you weren't just resting your eyes." When I turned, Mrs. Halpern stood there with her coat wrapped tight, her breath curling into the winter air. "Come on," she said. "No one should sleep in a car at our age." Her house sat just 2 lots over from the one I'd built with my husband. The one Thomas now closed off like a forbidden wing in a mansion. I didn't look at it as I followed her, but I felt it anyway, like a bruise under heavy clothing. The stairs to her garage apartment shook slightly under my steps. Not unstable, just old. Like everything in our neighborhood. Like me if I was honest. She pushed open the door and a wave of cool air drifted out, carrying the scent of old pine boards and lavender cleaning powder. The light inside flickered once before settling into a soft, amber glow. "It's not much," she said, brushing her hand over the counter as though dusting away an invisible apology. "But it's warm when the heater behaves." I nodded because warmth wasn't what I was desperate for. I just needed a door that wouldn't close behind me with someone else's key. I set my small bag down, barely any weight to it. Strange how a life can shrink into a single sack when grief and circumstance push it hard enough. The room was simple. A narrow bed, a small table, one window facing the street. But standing there, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Space. My own space. Later that night, after thanking her more times than she needed to hear, I sat on the bed and listened. The heater rattled softly in the corner, trying its best. Beyond the window, the distant hum of cars on the highway rolled like faraway waves. It wasn't loud enough to drown out my thoughts, but it softened them. I leaned back against the wall and let the quiet settle around me. My body ached from sleeping upright in the driver's seat for 2 nights. My neck still held the shape of the steering wheel. It was the kind of exhaustion that lived deep in the bones, the kind you feel after a funeral, when the last casserole dish is washed and people stop calling, but the house stays haunted anyway. My eyes traced the wooden ceiling beams. Someone, maybe her late husband, had carved initials into one of them. Small, hopeful graffiti left behind by a life that felt far more certain than mine. I thought of Thomas. His voice the last few weeks. Careful, polite, almost too gentle, like he was trying not to bruise something he'd already broken. I replayed conversations in my mind, searching for the moment the ground shifted. Had it been when Lily passed? Or was the fracture always there, waiting? Hindsight is cruel like that. It lets you see the cracks only when the house has already fallen. Around midnight, there was a soft knock on the doorframe. Not loud. Just enough that I knew it wasn't a mistake. "Got you some tea," Mrs. Halpern said from the doorway, holding a chipped mug between her hands. The steam rose like a small offering. I took it with a quiet thank you. She didn't step inside. She just lingered there, the hallway light behind her making her look like a silhouette cut from warm paper. "Families break in strange ways after loss," she said. Not unkind. Not probing. Just a truth she carried from her own long life. I nodded, though the words sank differently in me. Because what I felt wasn't the clean break of grief. It was the slow, intentional snap of betrayal. She must have seen something in my eyes, because her hand hovered near my arm, almost touching, then withdrew. "Write things down," she murmured. "When life gets blurry, paper remembers." After she left, I pulled a notebook from my bag. Just a thin spiral one. I'd grabbed it from the glove compartment days earlier without knowing why. I wrote the date. Then the words Thomas said last night. Then what his mother did that morning. Then every detail that suddenly felt sharper than it had at the time. The pen shook at first, but steadied as I kept writing. By the time I closed the notebook, something inside me felt a little less lost. Not whole, just anchored. I crawled under the blanket, pulling it up to my chin. The room was cold, but it was an honest cold. Not the kind that settles in when you're unwanted, but the kind that simply exists, waiting patiently for warmth. The heater clicked. The cars hummed in the distance. The air smelled faintly of lavender and old pine. And for the first time in weeks, I didn't brace myself for a door to lock. I didn't listen for footsteps in the hall. I didn't wonder if someone was deciding my fate in another room. I closed my eyes and let the stillness cover me. In a tiny apartment above a garage, on a night that could have been unbearable, I slept. Not peacefully, but without fear. And that was enough for now. The morning I walked into the community legal clinic, the sky hung low and gray, the kind that made everything feel heavier than it already was. The glass door creaked when I pushed it open, announcing me before I could change my mind. Inside, the air smelled faintly of toner ink and old carpet, the kind of scent that belonged to buildings where people came only when something in their lives had cracked. A young man looked up from behind a plastic divider. His eyes steady and unexpectedly gentle. "You here for walk-in hours?" he asked. His voice didn't rush. It didn't press. And for the first time in weeks, I felt myself exhale. The waiting room was small, just 4 chairs, each with their own uneven wobble. I sat in the corner by the water dispenser, listening to the slow, rhythmic dripping from its spout. It sounded like a clock that had forgotten the time but kept ticking anyway. I held my notebook in my lap, the one where I'd begun writing everything down. Little pieces of truth that felt too fragile to trust to memory alone. The pages were crinkled now, from cold fingers, from nights spent gripping it too tightly. Across the room, the young attorney sorted through a stack of papers. He moved with a kind of care I wasn't used to seeing in strangers. Each sheet lifted and set down as if it mattered. As if the stories written on them mattered. "Ma'am, you can come back now." His office was just a repurposed storage room. Mismatched chairs, a small wooden desk, one lamp humming faintly in the corner. But when he gestured for me to sit, something about the way he folded his hands told me I wouldn't be rushed here. I took a breath, the kind that trembles before leaving the body, and began telling him everything. Not smoothly, not in order, but honestly. And he listened, really listened, without a single interruption. When I finally stopped talking, the room felt impossibly still. Daniel, that was his name, leaned back slowly as though the air had thickened around him. His eyes softened, not with pity but with understanding. He asked questions, not the kind meant to challenge me, but the kind meant to illuminate corners I'd been too afraid to look into. When exactly did he change the locks? And did he ever provide written notice? Has anyone threatened you, directly or indirectly? Each question was a gentle tug, pulling loose threads I didn't realize were part of a larger pattern. I told him about the cold silence in the house, about Thomas checking with his mother before speaking to me, about the boxes stacked outside Lily's room. Each detail left my mouth like a stone dropping into deep water, and he let each one sink before reaching for the next. When I finished, he closed his notebook and rested his hands on it for a moment. His breath left him slowly, almost carefully. "What you've described," he paused, choosing his words as if they were glass he didn't want to shatter. "There are legal protections for this. You weren't just mistreated. Some of this could qualify as unlawful eviction." The word hung there, unlawful, like someone had finally said out loud what my body had known all along. I felt the smallest tremor in my chest. Not fear. Recognition. "Now," he continued gently, "I know legal action can feel overwhelming, especially when it's someone you once trusted." I looked down at my hands. They were clasped too tightly in my lap, knuckles pale. Dosu. Confrontation. Those things belonged to people louder than me. Braver maybe. Mark and I. We never believed in dragging our troubles out in public view. We believed in working things out around a kitchen table, not across a courtroom. "I'm not trying to cause trouble," I whispered. He nodded. "I know. Seeking justice isn't the same as seeking revenge." The quiet certainty in his voice surprised me. He said it like he'd had to learn that lesson himself. He slid a card across the desk but didn't push it toward me. He just placed it there, letting me decide whether to reach for it. "You don't have to decide today," he said. "But what happened to you isn't something you have to shoulder alone." I stared at the card. White, simple, with his name printed in clean black letters. Nothing dramatic. Nothing bold. But my hand moved toward it anyway, almost on instinct, fingers brushing the edge before lifting it. A small warmth flickered in my chest. Delicate, uncertain, but real. A feeling I hadn't carried in a long time. Hope, I realized. Or the beginning of it. When I stepped back outside, the gray sky had begun to lighten. Not fully. Just enough for the clouds to look thinner around the edges. The kind of subtle shift you only notice when you've been staring at shadows for too long. I stood on the sidewalk, Daniel's card in my hand, feeling its weight. Not heavy. Just present. Like a promise I wasn't sure I deserved, but one I suddenly found myself unwilling to let go of. Cars passed in slow intervals. A bus hissed at the intersection. Somewhere down the block, a wind chime trembled against the cold air. I slipped the card into my coat pocket, close to my heart, and let my breath ease out. I didn't know my next step. Not yet. But for the first time since Lily's passing, the road ahead didn't look closed. The papers were still warm from the sun when I laid them across the hood of Daniel's truck. They fluttered in the evening breeze like they were trying to leave, like even the past was tired of being held. Daniel stood a few steps away, quiet, letting me touch each page the way someone touches the edges of an old wound. The light was soft, the kind that turns everything forgiving, but my hands trembled anyway. I could hear the house breathing behind the trees. And for the first time, I wondered if it ever truly belonged to me. Or if I'd only been borrowing its warmth. We worked in silence, Daniel and I. He passed me folders without speaking, as if words might break the fragile thread holding me together. Inside the first folder were the mortgage papers, crisp once, now yellowed at the edges. Mark had signed his name with that stubborn upward tilt at the end, the one he said made his signature feel hopeful. I traced it with my thumb, surprised at how cold the ink felt after all these years. The next envelope held photographs. I didn't open it right away. The weight of it alone was enough to send a small ache through my chest. But eventually I slipped the pictures out. There was Mark halfway through building the porch. He had sawdust in his hair and a smile that didn't need an explanation. Behind him, Lily sat cross-legged on the grass, pretending to read the instruction manual upside down. Her cheeks were rounder then, full of the life she carried everywhere like a lantern. Another photo, Lily's 6th birthday. The oak tree stood wide and certain behind her, the branches curved like arms protecting whatever happened underneath them. We'd hung ribbons from the low limbs that year. They danced in the wind the way her laughter used to. Holding those pictures steadied me. And it broke me. Memories often do both. Daniel didn't ask if I was all right. He just waited, leaning against the truck, watching the road in that patient way of his. Sometimes compassion is quiet. Not soft, just quiet. When we finished sorting everything, the sun had already dipped low enough to turn the air blue. I told Daniel I needed to walk home on my own. He nodded and didn't argue. The road to the house was familiar. Too familiar. My feet knew exactly where to step, even after all these weeks of pretending I didn't want to come back. The sky was thinning into dusk, and the cicadas had already begun their nightly confessions. As I turned the last corner, the house came into view. My house, or what used to be. The lights were on inside, warm and steady, spilling onto the yard like nothing had changed. Shadows moved behind the curtains, slow, comfortable, belonging to people who had never earned that comfort. I stopped near the fence, hidden by the overgrown hydrangeas. From there I could see the living room. Mark's armchair, the one he said fit the shape of his back better than anything else, sat exactly where it always had. Except now, Thomas's father was in it. Leaning back, leg crossed, remote in hand, flipping through channels with the ease of ownership like he'd practiced it. The sight hit me like cold water. Not loud, not violent, just clarifying. This wasn't grief. Not theirs anyway. It was replacement. An erasure carefully performed in plain sight. I watched him a long time, letting the truth settle in my bones. Some truths need a moment to choose where they want to live inside you. The porch light flickered as someone walked past inside. Thomas maybe. Or his mother. Their silhouettes stretched long across the hallway. Thin, wavering things. I tried to imagine them crying for Mark. For Lily. For the family I lost. But silhouettes don't hold grief well. They bend too easily. I pressed my palm against the wooden fence. Cold. Rough. Real in a way everything inside that house no longer was. I didn't speak at first. My breath clouded the air. Faint, trembling fog. Like even the night wasn't sure it should listen. Then I whispered, "I'm doing my best, Mark." The words came out thinner than I expected. Not a promise. Not a plea. Just the truth, small and unsteady, but mine. And saying it there, outside the house that had carried every version of our lives, did something to me. Something quiet. Thomas's father laughed at something on the television. The sound drifted through the walls like a reminder. Or a warning. Maybe both. I stepped back from the fence. Slowly. Carefully. Like I was walking away from a grave. But there was no fear in me. Not then. What I felt was height. As if my spine had straightened without asking permission. As if the ground underneath me had finally agreed to hold my weight. I had spent so long shrinking under grief that I forgot I could stand. The walk back to the garage room felt lighter, though nothing around me had changed. The same broken streetlights. The same gravel crunching under my shoes. The same moon climbing its tired way through the branches. But I felt taller. Not in body. In something deeper, somewhere I hadn't touched in a long time. I glanced back once. The house glowed softly in the distance. A lantern in the dark. A memory trying to pretend it was still alive. I didn't reach for it this time. Didn't ache for it. I just kept walking, letting the night fold itself around me. Letting the silence settle. Letting myself grow, inch by quiet inch, into whatever came next. And for the first time, I didn't feel erased. The envelope arrived just after noon, carried by a man who didn't look up from his clipboard. He held it out like a fragile thing, though nothing inside it was fragile at all. When he left, the paper smell lingered in the hallway, sharp and unfamiliar, as if it had blown in from a colder world. I stood there for a moment, fingers resting on the sealed edge, listening to the hum of Mrs. Halpern's old refrigerator in the next room. Somewhere outside, a car door slammed. Deep breath. A voice I knew too well beginning to rise. And I realized the day had finally chosen its shape. Mrs. Halpern was knitting by the window when Thomas's footsteps came up the walkway. Heavy, uneven, irritated. She didn't look up, but she paused mid-stitch. That pause told me everything. I set the envelope on the table. The court papers inside felt heavier than they should have. Not because of the ink, but because of what they declared. That I was no longer willing to disappear quietly. The afternoon light slanted across the carpet in pale strips, dust drifting through the warmth like slow-moving snow. My heart kept time with every creak of the porch. I could hear Thomas muttering before he reached the door. Disbelief, frustration, a low simmer of something he tried to call grief when it suited him. When he knocked, it wasn't a question. It was a demand dressed as courtesy. Mrs. Halpern cleared her throat softly. A warning. Or maybe a blessing. I stepped toward the door, feeling the calmness that sometimes comes before a storm. Not peace exactly, but readiness. The kind that settles in your bones when you've run out of places to back away from. The knob felt cool against my hand. Steadying. And when I opened the door, The world outside brightened like it had been waiting for the moment too. Thomas stood there with the papers already crumpled in his fist. His face was flushed, jaw tight, eyes wide like someone waking from a dream they didn't want to leave. "What is this?" he demanded, lifting the envelope as if I might pretend not to see it. Behind him, his parents sat in the car, his mother stiff as a post, his father gripping the steering wheel like the entire situation could be driven into submission if he held tight enough. I didn't step outside. I didn't invite him in. I just stood in the doorway, the wooden frame cool against my shoulder. "It's what needed to happen," I said softly. Thomas shook his head, laughter catching in his throat like a cough. "You blindsided me. After everything. You think this is fair?" "Fair." The word nearly startled a smile out of me, but I kept my face still. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing once across the porch. "You're grieving. You don't know what you're doing. My family, we've always handled things our way. It's tradition." I let the silence stretch. Long enough for his parents to shift uncomfortably in the car. Long enough for the truth to gather around us like a slow-moving fog. Thomas stopped pacing. His eyes landed on mine, searching maybe for permission, maybe for an escape hatch. But I didn't offer either. "My grief," I said, "is not a reason for you to rewrite my life." He blinked. The porch seemed to lean closer, listening. "I'm not trying to rewrite anything," he insisted. But there was a tremor in his voice, small but real. He wasn't used to being confronted with his own reflection. "Thomas," I whispered, "I know you think this is about family, about duty, maybe even about honor." The word felt strange on my tongue. Dated. Ill-fitting. "But boundaries aren't betrayals," I continued. "And homes don't get inherited by intimidation." His shoulders dropped, almost imperceptibly, like something inside him sagged under its own weight. From the car, his mother looked away first. His father's jaw tightened in a way that said he already understood how this would end, that he had always known, even as they pretended otherwise. Thomas stared at the papers. The wind tugged at the corner of one page, lifting it like a quiet reminder that things were already in motion. I watched him realize there was no version of this moment where I stepped back into the shadows they'd prepared for me. For the first time he looked small. Not weak, just confronted. As if he'd finally reached the edge of the story he'd been telling himself. He met my eyes again. And in that brief second I saw recognition. Not agreement. Just recognition. It was enough. I drew the door closer, slowly, giving him time to speak if he wanted to. He didn't. The sunlight cut across the porch, dividing us in a thin, golden line. I stepped back into the house, letting that line break between us. "Goodbye, Thomas," I said, barely above a breath. The latch clicked with a soft finality, a sound that settled in the room like dust finding its place. Only then did my hands begin to tremble. Not with fear, with release. As if my body had been holding its breath for months and could finally exhale. Mrs. Halpern looked up from her chair, knitting paused in her lap, her eyes kind and unsurprised. Outside, the car engine started. The world shifted a little. Inside, so did I. Courtrooms don't echo the way I imagined. The walls seemed to swallow sound instead of carrying it, holding every whisper like it's something sacred. When I walked in that morning, the air felt still, not tense, not heavy, just held. As if the room itself had learned to wait for truth the way trees wait for winter to pass. The carpeting smelled faintly of dust and old files. The kind of scent you don't notice unless you're already nervous. I took my seat, folding my hands gently in my lap. Across the aisle, Thomas shifted, eyes darting away whenever they brushed past mine. And the silence settled between us like a long, thin sheet of glass. The judge entered with the quiet authority of someone who knew how to listen, not just to words but to the spaces around them. I watched him take his seat, slow, deliberate, and felt my own heartbeat match his pace. Steady, measured. Thomas sat stiffly, his parents flanking him like matching statues. His mother's purse rested on her knees, knuckles white around the straps. His father leaned back with an air of resignation, like he'd rather be anywhere else but felt obligated to stay. Daniel sat beside me, adjusting one paper at a time, aligning edges with the precision of someone who understood how much clarity mattered. His calmness was a quiet balm, not loud, not heroic, just present. And in a place like that, presence was a kind of protection. I tried to breathe evenly, but my chest fought each inhale. Courtrooms are strange places when it's your life being discussed. Your past laid out like a puzzle for strangers to interpret. Your pain measured in timelines and property lines. My fingers traced the edge of the wooden bench. The grain ran smooth under my skin. Familiar, like something homemade. Something steady. When the clerk called the case, my throat tightened. Not with fear. More like recognition that I'd been walking toward this moment for a long, long time. Daniel stood first. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. His calmness carried more weight than anger could have. He laid out the timeline like stones placed one by one across a riverbed. Clear. Simple. Undeniable. The judge watched him with a still expression, hands folded neatly, eyes moving only when a detail required it. Every fact Daniel mentioned seemed to settle softly into the room, like dust deciding where to land. Across the aisle, Thomas fidgeted. His mother leaned in to whisper something, but he didn't respond. He kept his gaze locked on the table in front of him, jaw clenched so tightly the muscle pulsed. Their lawyer stood with a practiced ease, arguing that inviting them into the house had been an unspoken handover, an implication of shared control, even ownership. He spoke of tradition, of family hierarchies, of the way things were understood in certain households. But the judge's face didn't change. No nods, no frowns. Just the same quiet watchfulness, like a man waiting for a photograph to finish developing. My pulse slowed slightly. Not because we were winning, I wouldn't let myself assume that, but because the truth, for once, didn't feel like it was slipping through my fingers. Felt anchored. When they called me to speak, my legs felt lighter than they should have. As if part of me was still sitting, refusing to follow. The witness chair was colder than the bench. Harder too. But it held me upright, and that was enough. I spoke quietly, not out of fear, but because loudness felt unnecessary. I told them about the home Mark and I built, piece by piece. The porch he measured twice because he wanted it welcome wide, as he jokingly called it. The oak tree under which Lily had blown out her birthday candles year after year. I spoke about the night I left. How the walls had already begun to forget me. How my key no longer felt like it belonged in the lock. My voice trembled only once. When I mentioned Lily's quilt, the one stitched with mismatched fabrics, the one she insisted would be her forever blanket. Seeing it thrown on a stranger's sofa had shaken loose a kind of grief I wasn't prepared for. For a moment, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Even the fluorescent lights felt dimmer, like they were listening. The judge didn't interrupt. Didn't look impatient. His stillness felt almost protective, like he understood that sometimes the smallest truths were the heaviest to carry. When I finished, I exhaled slowly. The sound surprised me. I hadn't realized I'd been holding anything in. But I had. So much. The clerk announced the hearing adjourned, and the room began to stir. Papers rustling, chairs scraping gently against the floor. But for a moment I didn't move. I just sat there, letting the tension drain one heartbeat at a time. Thomas didn't look at me as he left. His parents walked ahead of him, shoulders stiff, avoiding even the corner of my vision. Daniel touched my elbow lightly. A silent cue that it was time to go. I stood, not quickly, not slowly, just enough to feel my feet steady beneath me. When we stepped into the hallway, the air felt different. Lighter. Like someone had opened a window I hadn't noticed before. And for the first time in months, the breath I released felt like it belonged to me. The house looked different from the sidewalk. Smaller. Like someone had washed it too many times and the color had started to fade. I stood there for a long moment, keys cold in my hand, listening to the faint rattle of wind against the gutters Mark installed years ago. They used to hum on stormy nights, a sound Lily said reminded her of sleepy whales. Now they sounded like something remembering. Not longing, just remembering. When I finally walked up the steps, the wood groaned beneath my weight, as if the house itself was surprised to feel me again. Thomas wasn't home. Daniel had arranged this window of time, telling me gently that it would be easier this way. I didn't argue. There are good silences and bad silences, and Thomas and I had run out of the good kind. His mother answered the door before I even lifted my hand to knock. She didn't say hello. She just stepped aside, lips pressed into a line as thin as fishing wire. Her eyes followed me through the living room, not accusing, not welcoming, just tracking, like a shadow that couldn't decide whether it belonged to me or the house. The air inside felt stale, as though no window had been opened since I left. Not out of neglect, more like fear that fresh air might invite old truth back in. I walked slowly, my footsteps sinking into the carpet that had once cushioned Lily's running leaps into Mark's arms. Now it muffled everything, turning even my breathing into something cautious. Every corner felt a little smaller, as if the walls had drawn tighter around themselves to protect a version of the story they preferred. But I wasn't here for the story. I was here for the remnants, whatever pieces of myself had survived inside these walls. Lily's room was at the end of the hallway. I paused outside her door, letting my fingers rest on the frame. The wood was cool, not unfriendly, just untouched. When I pushed the door open, the stillness met me like an old friend. Nothing had changed. Not the arrangement of the books on her shelf. Not the sticker on the window that always peeled at the corner. And on the bed, folded with an almost reverent precision, was her quilt. The same quilt she dragged across the house every morning, half the squares frayed from being caught under her heels. The same quilt that traveled with us to the hospital on her worst days, because she insisted it was her armor. Seeing it now, untouched and waiting, made something in my chest pull tight. I walked over slowly, as though any sudden movement might startle the air. When I picked up the quilt, the fabric felt softer than I remembered, worn thin in places where her small fingers used to grip it. I pressed it to my chest, not out of longing, more out of recognition, like finding a missing page from a book I thought I'd lost. Behind me, I could feel Thomas's mother standing in the doorway, silent, watching. But for once, her presence didn't intrude. It felt distant, like a photograph of someone looking in from another life. I left Lily's room quietly, carrying the quilt over my arm. In the hallway, the light from the narrow window stretched in a thin line down the floorboards. I stepped into it without thinking, letting warmth brush the side of my face. The air smelled faintly of the lemon polish Mark used when he wanted the house to feel company ready. He used to hum while he worked, off-key but proud. I ran my fingers along the wall he painted himself. I still remembered the day he did it. The windows open, the paint trays rattling in the wind, Lily smudging her palms on the baseboard because she wanted to help. My fingertips traced the subtle unevenness of the brushstrokes, tiny imperfections that felt more honest than any argument we'd ever had. Behind me, Thomas's mother cleared her throat softly. "Take what you need," she said, voice barely above a whisper. Her tone was stiff but not cruel, more like someone reciting a line they'd been told to say. I nodded, not looking back. There was nothing between us that needed more words. As I moved down the hallway, my footsteps created a soft echo that followed me from room to room. Not haunting, just present, just true. And in that echo, something loosened. Not grief, not anger. Something quieter. Something that sounded almost like acceptance. When I stepped outside, the afternoon light had shifted, casting long shadows across the yard. I held the box of belongings close, Lily's quilt folded neatly on top. Thomas's mother stood in the doorway, arms crossed, face unreadable. She didn't say goodbye. I didn't expect her to. As I walked toward the street, the house behind me seemed to shrink a little more, not out of malice, but as though releasing what it no longer knew how to hold. Halfway down the walkway, I paused and listened. The wind brushed through the gutters again. This time the sound didn't ache. My footsteps echoed softly on the pavement, steady and sure. Not lonely anymore, just honest. And with each step, the weight I carried felt lighter, as if the past was learning how to let me go too. The courtroom lights flickered once, the way old bulbs do in quiet rooms. Nobody spoke. Not yet. It felt like the whole place was holding its breath, waiting for the weight of a single sentence to land. I remember staring at the edge of the judge's bench, a smooth, polished line, and thinking it looked like the horizon just before sunrise. A moment before change. A moment before something either breaks or heals. When the judge lifted the papers in front of her, the sound was so soft it could have been a bird stretching its wings. And just like that, everything in my life leaned forward. I didn't expect to feel calm. Not today. Not in this room where weeks of exhaustion had pooled like rainwater in my chest. The air carried the faint smell of old folders and too many whispered conversations. People shifted in their wooden seats. The kind of small, restless movements that reveal fear more than words ever could. Daniel sat beside me, his posture steady, his gaze set ahead. He didn't say anything. He rarely needed to. His presence alone felt like a hand around a candle flame, keeping it from blowing out. Across the aisle, Thomas sat between his parents. They looked like they belonged to another world entirely. Pressed clothes, tight expressions, perfectly arranged disappointment. His mother kept her chin lifted just enough to pretend she wasn't watching me. His father leaned forward, elbows on his knees, jaw clenched. He just looked tired. Not angry, not smug. Just hollow, like someone who'd been walking too long in the wrong direction. I thought of Lily then. Of the tiny shoes she used to leave by the front door. Of her quilt, the one I carried out of that house just days ago. My fingers curled in my lap. Whatever the verdict was, it wouldn't bring her back. But maybe, just maybe, it could return a piece of the life we built around her. The judge cleared her throat, and the quiet in the room shifted. Stretched thin, pulled tight. She spoke slowly, the way careful people do when their words can reshape someone's life. Her voice traveled across the room, over the polished floor, through the gap between us and them. It sounded distant and close at the same time, like hearing the ocean through a cracked window. I watched Daniel straighten slightly, as if preparing to steady me. I didn't move. When she said my name, my heart didn't leap or stutter. Simply listened. She outlined the facts, the documents, the timeline, the testimony. Every detail felt like another small stone clicking into place. Then she paused. That pause was long enough for me to hear Thomas swallow. Long enough to notice his mother tightening her grip on her purse. Long enough to feel the entire building inhale. The judge looked up, eyes meeting mine for a brief second. Steady, clear, almost warm. The property, she said, legally belongs to the petitioner. Her words moved through the room like a quiet wave rolling onto shore. No drama. No grand announcement. Just truth. Finally placed in the open. Gasps broke somewhere behind me. Someone whispered something sharp. Someone else murmured a prayer. But I didn't react. My body stayed very still, as if any movement might scatter the moment like dust. The judge wasn't finished. She continued, outlining deadlines, responsibilities, the formal order for Thomas to vacate the home. Each sentence settled gently onto my shoulders. Not heavy, not harsh, just real. When I finally looked over at Thomas, he wasn't looking at me. His eyes were fixed on the floor, shoulders sagging inward. His parents, once so stiff and certain, had gone pale. For a brief, fragile second, I saw something I hadn't expected. Not resentment, not anger. Grief. Quiet, unpolished grief. We were all broken by the same loss, but not all of us had turned that pain into cruelty. Some of us had simply forgotten how to be human with each other. Daniel's hand came to rest lightly on my arm. A grounding touch. A reminder that I wasn't drifting anymore. I didn't smile. I didn't cry. I just let the verdict settle into my bones the way morning light settles across a cold room. slowly, gently, revealing more than it replaces. For the first time in months, I felt the faint outline of a future. Outside the courthouse, the autumn air wrapped around me like something half forgotten. Warm, softer than it should have been for the season. I closed my eyes and let the sun rest against my face. People walked past, murmuring, moving, living, but the noise didn't touch me. Not today. Today, everything felt strangely still. I drew in one long, even breath. Not shaky. Not heavy. Just mine. Justice doesn't heal the places that grief hollowed out. It doesn't stitch the past back together or return the things we lost. But it clears the ground. Makes room for new steps. New doors. New mornings. As I exhaled, a quiet thought rose inside me, steady and sure. Can rebuild. I will. The porch steps creaked under my weight the way old bones greet the cold. Even before I saw him, I could hear Thomas's uneven breathing. Soft, unsure, drifting between apology and cowardice. He stood at the edge of the porch, shoulders hunched, the house key dangling from his fingers. A tiny sliver of metal that had started wars inside me. The wind moved through the trees behind him, shaking loose a few brittle leaves. They fell between us like quiet punctuation marks. When he finally held the key out to me, he still didn't lift his gaze. And somehow, that felt right. It had been a week since the verdict. 7 days of silence, papers, arrangements, the slow untying of a life that never should have been tethered to mine in the first place. I didn't expect him to come alone. But there he was. No parents flanking him. No stiff lawyer watching from the corner. Just Thomas, in a wrinkled shirt and tired eyes, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. He held the key between his thumb and forefinger, like it might burn him if he gripped too tightly. I'm sorry. The words barely made it past his lips. They trembled, thin and fragile, but they were real. Not enough to repair anything. Not enough to rewind time. But enough to mark the end of whatever bitterness lingered between us. I took the key gently, letting the metal rest cold against my palm. Thank you, I said. Simple. Measured. Spoken not for him, but for me. The version of me that had carried more anger than she ever wanted. A small nod from him, still not meeting my eyes. Then he stepped back, hands in his pockets, as if afraid the porch itself might reject him. When he finally walked away, he didn't look over his shoulder. The quiet that followed didn't sting the way I imagined it would. Felt clean. The door resisted a little when I pushed it open, like the house was exhaling after being held too long by strangers. The first breath inside wasn't familiar. A mix of heavy spices, store-bought candles, and something sharp like bleach. It layered itself over the walls, temporary and proud. And beneath it, faint but steady, was us. The life Mark and I had built, still lingering like the ghost of warm bread or old laughter. I stood in the entryway for a long moment, letting my senses adjust. The floorboard under my left foot still creaked, a soft, remembering sound. Exhaled. One room at a time I moved through the house. Not searching. Just acknowledging. My fingers brushed the door frames the way you might touch the bark of an old tree, gently with quiet reverence. Some rooms felt tighter, cluttered with choices I never made. Others felt hollow, stripped of their meaning the moment Lily's footsteps vanished from them. I opened windows one by one, letting the cool afternoon air slip inside. The curtains lifted, breathed, then fell again. The house responded slowly. Walls releasing old smells. Corners softening. Light finding its way back in. By the time I reached the hallway, it felt almost like walking through a memory I wasn't afraid of anymore. Almost. Lily's room was last. It always is. The door gave a quiet sigh as I pushed it open. Dust floated through the fading sunlight, moving like tiny fragments of time suspended in air. Her quilt lay on the bed exactly where I placed it last week, folded neatly, corners precise, waiting in a way that made my throat tighten. I wasn't prepared for how heavy it would feel when I lifted it. Not physically, quilts aren't heavy. But memory is. Love is. Holding something she once held feels like carrying the whole world and none of it at the same time. I spread it across the bed with slow, careful movements. The colors looked softer than I remembered. Maybe they always did. My knees weakened before I realized I was crying. Not the sharp kind of crying that slices through the ribs. This was quieter. A release, like water finding the lowest point and settling there. I cried for beginnings, not endings. For the return of something I thought had vanished forever. Not the object, but the permission to feel her presence without fear. When the last tear slipped down my cheek, I wiped it with the back of my hand. The room didn't feel haunted anymore. Felt honest. And honesty, I realized, was a kind of homecoming. The sun was sinking when I stepped back into the hallway. Warm orange light stretched across the floorboards, pulling the house into a softer shape. I walked through each room slowly, letting the warmth brush against my skin. Everything looked different. And yet, somehow, truer than before. On the front porch, I turned the key in the lock. This time, the click sounded gentle. Not a barrier, but a boundary reclaimed. I stood there for a moment, the evening air wrapping around me like a thin blanket. The future didn't feel distant anymore. Felt reachable, quiet, steady. I took a single breath, deep enough to settle something inside me. And as I stepped off the porch, I knew. The house was mine again. Not because paper said so, but because peace finally opened the door.